Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ashley Davidson, and I'm the Chief Development Officer with the Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation. Glad to have you all joining us this afternoon for our webinar, Planning Your Legacy One Step at a Time. And I've got joining me this afternoon, Jim Sweetlove. And Jim, I'll let you introduce yourself first, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be here and participate in one of these webinars again. Just a little bit about me. I'm a retired lawyer, and I emphasize retired, proudly retired. I primarily practiced in the areas of estate planning, estate administration, estate litigation for something over 40 years. And I was at that time certified by the Law Society as a specialist in estates and trusts. But I'm not providing legal advice today. I want to emphasize that because I'm retired. I'm just going to give observations based on my experience, both as during the time that I was in practice and from serving on the board of a number of charities, including, I'm proud to say, the Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation, where I served for 6 years and where I was very proud to be chair for 2 years. So I'm here to give whatever information and observations that I can.
That's great. Thank you so much for being here, Jim. We appreciate that. We also have joining us Dr. Frank Fornasier. And Frank, I'll ask you to introduce yourself to our group.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm very glad to be here. I'm Dr. Frank Fornasier, and I'm a hospitalist at Joseph Brant Hospital. I'm the head of the hospital medicine service. What's a hospitalist, a lot of people say? Well, a hospitalist is generally a family doctor or an internist who specializes in inpatient care. So I take care of patients only inside the hospital, and I have a whole team that helps me. I'm also the Chief Medical Information Officer at the hospital and the Chair of Health Records, and I have a great interest in palliative care and end-of-life care, as well as really loving the work that our Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation does in terms of raising awareness about the hospital and obviously helping to fund us and help us continue the work that we do. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks for having me, Ashley.
That's great. Thank you so much, Frank. And thank you again to all of our guests who've joined us this afternoon. Look forward to some really interesting and engaging conversation around legacy giving. So if anyone has questions, please put those into the Q&A at the bottom. There's a little double comment button that says Q&A, and if you type those in there, we'd be happy to answer the questions as we go along. And if we don't get to anything during the course of the conversation, I'll be happy to circle back and ask those questions of our panelists towards the end of the conversation. And I do expect to be about 45 minutes to maybe an hour this afternoon. And so looking forward to getting started. And Jim, I'll ask you a question first. I'll start with you if that's okay. So before we talk about sort of the actual steps to take when thinking about legacy planning, can you talk to us a little bit about why it's important for folks to even consider planning their legacy? And for those who have already done so, why it's important to review those plans and to think about those on an ongoing basis from time to time?
Certainly. Bottom line, if you want things to happen the way they would happen if you were there telling people what should happen, you need to make a plan. If you don't have a will, or your will isn't up to date and it doesn't accurately reflect those wishes, they're not going to get carried out. If you don't have a will, the province will determine how your assets are to be distributed. It may not be the way that you want them distributed. In fact, it's probably unlikely that's going to be the way you want them distributed. You won't be able to set up trusts for grandchildren. You won't be able to make charitable provisions in your will, and you won't be able to take advantages of some of the tax provisions that are available to you if you don't have a proper plan in place. If you've already got something in place, and I often used to get the question as well, how often should I revise it? It's really not how often I should revise it, it's how often should I look at it. Mm-hmm. You should look at it periodically, whether that's every 2 years or every 5 years, whatever, because things change. Your family changes, you get older, your family gets older, Your grandchildren become adults. And hopefully you're still around to see that. And the priorities that you have change over time. Your families change and the relationships end, relationships start. And you may want to reflect those things in your plan. Your assets change. When you look at what you have now compared to what you had 10 years ago, the value of those assets and what they consist of may be very different than what they were at that time. So if you haven't got a plan in place, you're not going to be able to ensure that things happen the way you want to. And the laws change from time to time. The laws have changed with regard to powers of attorney, with regard to tax implications when a person passes away. So if you haven't got a current plan, you're not going to be able to make it fit into those parameters the way you want it to.
That's great. Thanks, Jim. And when, for those folks who are perhaps just starting out that journey of planning, what would you suggest is a good first step? Where should people start? What's the, what are they thinking about first when they embark upon that thought process?
Well, the first thing to do is to talk about it. Talk about it to your spouse primarily, your partner. And if you can get comfortable with it, talk about it to your family. Then the next thing is to start writing things down. Now, lots of places out there have, I'm going to call them inventories or forms that you can use as a plan. Lawyers have them, banks have them, financial planners have them, funeral homes have them. They're a good place for you to start recording what you've got, because that will prompt you to think about, if something happens to me, what do I want to see happen to all these things? And that will allow you to write down the names of your family, your friends, the charities that you want to benefit, to kind of get your mind around what you're going to try and do in this plan. I would say that's the first step.
Great, thanks, Jim.
And don't rush to do it. Do a part of it, go back and look at it. Then you'll probably find that you've forgotten something or forgotten someone, or someone will remind you that you've forgotten someone.
Yeah, certainly a second look at that list makes a lot of sense, I would think.
Yep.
Yeah. And so once you've come up with that list, you've thought about your possessions and to whom you might like to leave your items, you'll need someone obviously to take care of that for you once you pass. And generally that would be, of course, an executor or a trustee. So Jim, can you talk to us about what aspects someone should consider when they're thinking about who they might appoint as an executor or a trustee for their estate?
Sure. Now, the one thing I would say right off is you've talked about possessions. When a lot of people, when they think about possessions, they think about the things in their house. It's more like my assets.
Right.
And a lot of assets people have, they don't even think about. But if they go through a process of listing them, maybe they'll catch them. Or when they go and visit a professional advisor, they'll say, things that people might not even consider to be possessions. The points you have on a loyalty program, those are possessions. They have a value. Somebody might like to have those. There's all kinds of things that are around now that weren't around in the past, that are assets and are of value. So when you want to select somebody who's an executor, who to be your executor, there's a whole myriad of considerations. And I would say that every situation is unique unto itself. I used to get people come in and say to me, well, I've got 3 kids, I'll just make them all the executors. Well, think about, do they get along?
Right.
Are they going to be happy with the plan you make? Now, I've had lots of people tell me, oh yeah, they'll be fine with anything I say. And then after the fact, they're not fine with anything you say. So you've got to think about, if you make them all executors, is that going to make everybody happy? If you exclude somebody, they're going to feel like they're not getting all the information all the time, and they're not going to be happy. Where do they live? Do they live locally? Do they live a long way away? Now, living a long way away isn't as much of a concern as it used to be because of technology and the ability to use the internet and so on, and to deal with financial institutions from long distances, but it may be a practical difficulty. And if they live other than in Canada or somewhere in the British Commonwealth, there are what are called bonding considerations for people who live, for example, in the United States, in order to be an executor here in Canada. And when I talked about their availability because of where they live, think about their availability in terms of their lives. Are they such extremely busy people with their own careers and their children and maybe health considerations, whatever, that they may not have the time to devote to this? So you've got to weigh all those things in the balance. And some people, when they get to the end of the day, they say, well, I really don't have anybody in my family who's capable of doing this. I'm going to go and talk to a trust company, for example, who can take this on for me for a fee. And in some circumstances, that is the best solution, or to have the trust company plus family members. The other thing is, your family members don't have to have, whoever you select as executor, they don't have to have a tremendous amount of expertise. They probably haven't done this before.
Right.
After they've done it for you, they may never want to do it again. But bottom line, they can get the expertise that they need. If they need expertise, they can hire a trust company to do things for them. They can hire an accountant. They can have the lawyer do all kinds of things for them. So there's a balance involved there, and every situation is different. And you might want to talk to them about, would you be comfortable doing this job? What you might want to find out from, you can do this research online, all the duties of an executor, and there are a lot. And to say to them, do you want to take these on? Do you want to have somebody else do them for you? And make your decision based on that. But talking about it to the executor, you don't want a surprised executor when you pass away who had no idea that they were going to be put in this position.
Yeah, absolutely, Jim. It's a big responsibility. And so something that you want to be very thoughtful about in terms of who you select. And to your point, and I think it's a very important one, letting that individual know, or individuals know, that they have been selected to fulfill this role, and ensuring that they understand the scope and responsibility of the role is really quite key process. So that's great. Thank you. So now my next question, and I'll pose this either, I think Jim or Frank, you could probably answer this for us. And it's a bit of a longer question. So I think something we've all thought about now and then is that there may come a time in our lives where we become unable to make financial or healthcare decisions for ourselves. So can you explain to us the why appointing a power of attorney to make those decisions is so important? And then also speak a little bit about, if you haven't appointed someone as your power of attorney, how do those important financial and healthcare decisions get made for you when you're unable to do that for yourself?
I'll let Frank lead off on this one.
Jim, come on. I was loving listening to you. You're like a font of information. Very, very good. Talking about a power of attorney, and there's the power of attorney of healthcare and for financial issues. I'm going to focus on healthcare, and I'll let Jim deal with the finance part. It's important to have a power of attorney for healthcare, because when you become very ill, you want to have someone you trust making decisions, but you also want them to know what it is that you would like. And I think that's probably the most important part. And it's, illness is funny because I see it, unfortunately, constantly. People coming in critically ill who really did not expect to become seriously ill. And, without a clear power of attorney, especially in a case where perhaps you're a widow or widower and there would be like 3 or 4 or 5 children, they would all become equally responsible. I'm just going to step back for a second and just lay it out. So the way that it is when you're in a hospital, if you have a written document, then obviously they follow the written document. Otherwise, the law prescribes that it's your spouse or partner who would become the power of attorney initially as the first person. If they're not available, then it goes to children, and then it goes to siblings, and then it just keeps moving on down the line in terms of people related to you. And as Jim mentioned earlier, not everyone is equally capable of making a decision. So oftentimes you'll have someone in the family who you perhaps maybe the eldest or just someone who you feel can carry that burden because it's very difficult to make the decision. Or perhaps you really do feel that it's something that should be spread equally. But in any case, it's important to really designate the person that you feel is going to best represent your wishes. The next piece of that, obviously, is communicating those wishes, and I think that we'll talk about that a bit later. But that's from the healthcare perspective, it becomes very important. Of course, if you have no relatives that are available or willing to do it, then there's a public guardian who then becomes involved and has to help make decisions, and that really slows everything down. It makes it very difficult to make good decisions based on what it is that you would want. Jim, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Frank. Just to emphasize or re-emphasize what Frank has said, it's important that the person who you choose is attuned to your philosophy. Because the bottom line, and I'm sure Frank will endorse this, is that they are not to do things the way they want. They're to do things the way you would want if you were giving those instructions. So the more that they know about what you want and you have a buy-in, as it were, the better this is going to work. It also helps them tremendously to deal with, for example, other members of the family who say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Well, because mom or dad or uncle or whoever told me this is what they wanted to see happen. So it removes conflict as much as possible. It also can remove feelings of guilt from people who have to make really tough decisions. And I'm sure Frank sees this constantly. And if they're comfortable that they're making the decision the way the person wants them to, that helps a tremendous amount. They're really serving that person well. The financial power of attorney is a little more straightforward in terms of it gives the person the ability to look after the person's assets and finances just like they could. There are a lot of duties on a person who operates a financial power of attorney, and there's a significant amount of time when people don't do it properly. But the major part of it is that they have to be a person who keeps meticulous records of what they're doing, every penny, because they're accountable for every penny.
That's great. Thank you. So obviously, these can be difficult conversations to have. Nobody wants to talk about sort of what their end of life wishes would be. And I think oftentimes these are conversations happening between parents and children, and they're sensitive topics to people. So I would ask, any thoughts from both of you on how to approach those conversations. So if you're thinking about planning your own legacy and you want to have these important conversations, how do you approach that? It doesn't, necessarily come up around the dinner table. So what is a good way to approach that?
I'll get started, and then Jim
Thanks,
will have
Frank.
some great ideas as well. I think, I think about this a lot. I guess I'm a pretty straight shooter, and I came from a family where, my dad said, without prompting always, hey, this is what I would want, and this is what I don't want. So it in some ways, it seems strange that people don't have these discussions, but in fact, it's actually turns out that it's not super common that people talk about these things. So as as an individual, let's say that you're the patient. I don't want to call you the patient. Let's say you're the parent. Okay, you're and you say you want to have the discussion with your kids or with your spouse. Well, then it's relatively easy because you're bringing it up. And I think the important thing is to really begin to think about the issues that matter to you. Would you like your life at the end to be comfortable? Would you want aggressive measures because every single extra day matters to you? These are, would you like a feeding tube if that became obviously you couldn't swallow anymore? Would that be something that you like? Would you like to be intubated where they put you in the intensive care unit and they put a tube down your throat to breathe for you. If especially the probability of getting better is extremely low, or if the probability of recovering would be minimal. So in other words, you'd be alive, but you would be in a very poor state, kind of reliant on other people or needing nursing home care to proceed. Like, so these are important things to really, envision. And as Jim said earlier, things can change. So, you're in perfect health, you're golfing every day, you're cycling, you're doing, and you say something bad happens. Hey, you know what? Like, do everything. Things sometimes change. You end up with a chronic disease, like congestive heart failure, or a cancer that's advancing. Well, that changes things, because you understand that, okay, so I get better, but then I got to go through the rest of that cancer. So it changes what you would want in a critical situation. And those are the kinds of, hard things to think about. So for the kids, talking, say, to their parents or a loved one, or even a spouse talking to their loved one, sometimes it can be pretty intimidating. You say to somebody, hey, you know what, if you get super sick and you might die, what do you want me to do? Whoa, hey, I don't want to think about it.
Right.
But a lot of things happen in life. Other people get sick. So for example, a friend gets ill, critically ill, goes through hospital, and you happen to go to the hospital, or your loved one goes to the hospital, and you can talk about the experience. What do you think about the experience? What do you think about the way they went through that? Is that what you would want? Another way to do it is to bring up your own wishes, to say, you know what, if these certain things happen, this is what I would want for myself. So it almost gives permission for the other person, for the parent, to talk about what it is that they would want. And I think that's very important, permission, because sometimes, again, like I said, I come from kind of a black and white family in terms of this, but there are parents that feel guilty for saying, what, I'm tired. Like, if I get really that sick, I want to go, but I don't want my kids to feel bad. And the kids, on the other hand, would be saying, oh my God, I don't want to say, even though it looks obvious that things are looking bleak, I don't want to say, let Dad go, because I don't know, he might want to stay. And so you understand the predicament that everyone's in. There's so much stress. So when you make your wishes clear, it's a lot easier. So we talked about bringing it up yourself. We talked about looking at situations, maybe watching a movie, where, again, someone is going through a difficult situation. You go to the doctor's office, and, there's the pamphlets and things about advanced directives. And again, just, hey, you know what, this advanced directive thing, Dad, Mom, have you ever thought about this? So those are some ways that you can bring it up. And always, it's like you don't want it to be like confrontational in any way. This is a discussion, because really, in the end, the benefit is enormous to the person who makes the advanced directive. As Jim said, at the end of the day, there's so much stress when someone is critically ill. And family, if they're confused, really the amount of guilt and the amount of anxiety around making decisions is so hard. And I remind people all the time of what Jim said, is that, even if you don't know, try and speak through the eyes of your loved one, of your parent. Like, what if they were able to stand here perfectly healthy and look at themselves in this situation? What would they say? But it's, again, so much easier if the patient has outlined what it is that they would like or would not like. And that becomes critically important. Jim, I don't know if you have some other things to add.
Just a couple things, and everything you've said, I think, is extremely valuable. I particularly like that reference to, talking about friends of your parents who've gone through, or whoever it is, who's gone through something, and getting their feedback on how they would have handled that situation. Because everybody's parents, everybody in my generation, has friends who are going through these things, and people are observing it and making decisions based on what they see other people going through. Like Frank, I was in a situation where I'm an only child. I was the only one that had to make any decisions. I saw how my father made decisions with regard to my mother, and that made it pretty obvious to me how he would want things to be done if I had to make decisions. So I was lucky. But one of the other things that occurs to me, and maybe Frank, you can comment on this, as I was dealing with with a parent who had health issues and trying to grasp what he was dealing with and decisions to be made and so on. There were a couple occasions where I said to him, where he had doctor's appointments and so on, I said, look, would you like me to go with you to be there when you talk to the doctor about these things, where he outlines what you may have to deal with coming up? And my father said, yeah, but I didn't really want to ask you to go through that. I said, I would welcome the opportunity to be there and to hear you and the doctor talk about these things, so that I have a better idea of what we're dealing with here and what may come in the future.
Great.
Jim, that's a great point. And again, it goes back to communication, right? I mean, I think staying in the loop and asking for an opportunity to hear. And it's interesting, even what your dad said, like parents a lot of times don't want to bother their kids, but you know what? It's so valuable for everyone to be on the same page and understand. And for me, especially for doctor's appointments, I always tell people, even younger people, bring someone with you, because sometimes, especially important diagnosis, I don't mean, simple blood pressure check, but, for important appointments, people forget almost half of what they're told. And so to have another set of ears there to help analyze and understand what's going on, and even ask some questions perhaps that the patient themselves might not think of, can really lead to better understanding, again, of not only what the disease process is, but how you're going to deal with it.
That's great. Thank you both. Good advice, and I think good practical guidance for folks when trying to navigate these challenging times. Really, they are. Jim, in terms of sort of the more practical or technical side of things, how does one even go about creating a will? What is the first step towards that? And then, those accompanying documents, things like that power of attorney, how do those come to be established?
Well, my basic recommendation is that people should select a lawyer and go see a lawyer who does this kind of work, get a feel for them, and give them and work through giving them instructions. Now, there are will kits out there. There are power of attorney kits out there, because the basic package includes wills and powers of attorney of both kinds. And you can buy those you can get them online, you can get them from stationers and so on. But if there's anybody out there who's as old as I am, they might remember the old Fram Oil commercials where the guy said, you can pay me now or you can pay me later. When I used to get people come in the office after someone had died and there was a will that they'd done with a kit, you were almost mentally rubbing your hands and saying, well, there's going to be probably problems here, and it's going to cost them more to sort these out than if they'd had a proper plan in place in the first place. So it's important that you get good counsel, that you go and see a lawyer. And, that lawyer should be able to work with, if you've got a financial planner, should be able to work with your financial planner, should be able to work with your accountant, your bank, whatever, to make sure it's a seamless package and process that results.
Okay, that's great, Jim. Thank you. And sometimes, of course, as part of that making a will, folks are interested in leaving a charitable bequest or a gift to a charity that is important to them in those plans, which is wonderful. Of course, our foundation has been the beneficiary of many of those gifts over the years, and they have just a truly incredible impact on our hospital's ability to provide exceptional care to our community. So, Jim, could you speak a little bit about just the different ways one might be able to leave a gift of that type to a charity that's meaningful to them in their will? And what are the steps to include that type of information within your will?
Well, obviously there are a multitude of ways, just like you can leave bequests to individuals in a multitude of ways. It can be a monetary amount. It can be a share of your estate, as in a percentage. It can be a specific object, an asset. It can be things like publicly traded shares, for which there are some real tax advantages to giving them to a charity. It can be proceeds of insurance or an RSP or a RIF. Things can be set up in a trust to benefit a charity. And a couple of comments about that is you should get, as I said before, get the professional advice and make sure the plan all fits together. It's no good, well, I shouldn't say it's no good, but it can create a problem if you turn around and say, well, I'm going to designate the Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation as beneficiary of my insurance policy. And then you make provisions in your will that are contrary to that or conflict with that. You should make sure that your professional advisors talk to each other. People, in my experience, are adverse to getting that done because they think it's going to cost them more money to have their professional advisors talk to each other. I can tell you that it's the best way to go. Have your professional advisors talk to each other so that they all know what the other is, the portion of the plan that the other is putting together. And I would suggest that if this is a little bit off topic, but that if somebody is thinking about a charity or try to decide on a charity, there's any number of things that they can do to get comfortable with that. There's all kinds of information that you can find online. For example, the Hospital Foundation has lots of good information online as to how you can be effective in seeing your wishes carried out. You can talk to other people who've made bequests to charities and said, what did you do and how did it work and how happy were you with it? What would you do different if you had to do it over again? You can talk to the charity. I mean, I know you folks at the Hospital Foundation are very welcoming of people who call up and say, I'm thinking of doing something. I don't really know what I want to do. And getting the fit for that potential donor to make sure that, because they're the person that counts, bottom line. And it's not like you're going to come and say, oh, how much are you giving us tomorrow kind of thing. No, it's let's get to know you. Let's see what your priorities for you. And let's see if we can do something that you'll be proud of, your family will be proud of. So I think all those things are important. And, you know, for example, it's when you do get it in place, I would always encourage people, if they were comfortable with it, to let the charity know that you've done something. You don't have to tell them specifically what you've done, but to let them know that you've made a plan that includes them. Because I know, for example, at the Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation, we recognize those people through the Joseph Brant Society, which is very valuable. Now, some people will say, well, I don't want the recognition. I don't care about that. A lot of people say that, surprisingly. But, you know, I always would say to people, well, if you make it known, it encourages other people to think along the same lines, who will say, you know, I see in the annual report that so-and-so made a bequest to the hospital, and gee, you know, my circumstances aren't all that different from his. Maybe I could be doing something like that. So I always encourage people to let the charity know if they were comfortable with it. And it, you know, just call the charity and say, I want to talk to you about things. So
yeah, no, absolutely. You're right, Jim. And, you know, from the foundation's perspective, it gives us an opportunity to ensure that the donor understands just how important and impactful that gift is going to be to the organization. So oftentimes, you know, this is part of people's legacy, and it's really important for them to know, you know, what their gift is going to be used for, and that it is going to have a very significant impact. So that gives our foundation an opportunity to make sure those donors have that information about, you know, what is a very important choice and a very, you know, generous gift that they're making to the organization. So absolutely. Yeah. And when, you know, when people don't want to let us know that, that's certainly okay too. We respect people's wishes around that as well, but it is, to your point, it's oftentimes a nice opportunity for us to work with the donor and to get to know the donor. So we look forward to that opportunity always. That's great. Frank, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier around care for aging parents and care for our geriatric population here in the community. And of course, our, you know, the demographic of seniors in Burlington continues to grow, with, I think now 1 in 5 members of our community being in that 65 plus age group. So I thought our group this afternoon might like to hear a little bit from you just about our geriatric care program here at JBH, if you don't mind spending a few minutes just chatting about that.
Yeah, no problem. One of the amazing things about Canada, but Burlington in particular, is that the aging population is increasing very quickly. When I say aging, 65, but strangely, 65 is like 45 now. I mean, 65 is like you're a kid. And honestly, when you come into the hospital and you're 65 years old, I view you as a pediatric patient pretty much, because like, oh my God, don't even talk to me, you're too young. So there's different approaches that we're taking. So inside the hospital, because of the pandemic, we got rid of our acute integrated care of the elderly unit, not because we didn't think it was effective, but because of manpower, et cetera. But that program we're trying to do it really throughout the hospital, where we try and get people moving earlier rather than the old, you come into hospital, you just lay in bed. And, especially as you get older, you lose muscle mass. So we talk about the fact that for every day that you're laying still, it takes about 3 days to recover from that, to kind of get yourself back up. So you can imagine if you lay still for 7 days, how long it takes you to get back to your baseline. So we focus on early mobilization. We focus on looking through medications. We talk about, the term polypharmacy, which some people honestly come in on 35 medications. And sometimes, you have to be on a certain number of medications, but then as it's just logical that the more you take, the more probability there is that some of them are going to interact with each other. And so we like to review that with the pharmacy team and see, what do you have to take and what is optional. And can we reduce that? Can we reduce that number? And it does affect quality of life too, because when you're, trying to get 35 pills into yourself every day, it's hard. Like, it's not an easy thing. And sometimes we forget that, because you go to one doctor, they give you one thing, and the other guy gives something else, and somebody gives you something else. Sometimes you don't even know like what the other person is giving. And so we focus on that. Our rehab and stroke, especially our stroke program, which is what we call an integrated stroke unit, actually has the stroke unit, so the acute care of the patient, on the same floor as rehab. So you don't even switch beds. You just all of a sudden start rehab from that same bed. And we've seen that it decreases the length of stay. And most importantly, the reason that the length of stay is decreased is not because we just kick people out, but because people are improving more quickly. And that's obviously what we want. I know that the hospital is kind of looking at, how do we expand services, geriatric services? And I think we're starting to look at, through the OHT, the Ontario Health Teams, trying to look at really wellness. So rather than just illness, right? I mean, illness is part of life, but really we want to prevent illness. We recognize that that's probably more important than the acute care, is trying to avoid that. And so we're talking about different programs at the Wellness House to encourage fitness, encourage mental health. And so over the next year or so, as we come up with our new strategic plan at Joseph Brant Hospital, I think that you're going to see an increased focus on geriatric services at Joseph Brant. I'm very hopeful that we'll be able to update you over the next year as to what's coming, but it's a very important part of the future plan of Joseph Brant.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Frank. I do have a question from one of our attendees. It looks like it's a 3-part question, so I'll start at the beginning. It says here, is it better to stipulate monetary amounts versus a percentage of the residual estate after family and special beneficiaries? So maybe Jim, do you want to kick off with that one?
I think that's for me. It really depends on the circumstances. If it's not a large amount, when I say not a large amount, if it's $5,000, $10,000, maybe an amount is appropriate. For example, if it's for a friend, for a charity, whatever. If it's significant, then you might want to think about, should it be a percentage? There's pluses and minuses to both approaches. One of the things you want to consider is, will your estate always be the same size? If it's worth X today, is it always going to be worth X? And if you leave a significant amount of money in a bequest, is that going to get kind of out of proportion to your estate? If it's 10% today, in the future, is that suddenly going to become half your estate because you've had to use money for your health care or whatever? So that's one of the things to bear in mind, that if it's a significant amount, sometimes a percentage makes more sense. On the other hand, and in the legal world, there's always the on the other hand. On the other hand, if it's a percentage, then that beneficiary is entitled to a full accounting of every penny in your estate, because they have to know that they got the right amount that corresponds to their percentage, which means they have to see what everybody else got, what you had, et cetera, et cetera. And some people aren't comfortable with that. So it's a matter of which way works for you in your particular circumstances. And that's a long conversation to have with your legal advisor and your other professional advisors.
Okay, thanks, Jim. That's great. So the second portion of this, is it better to distribute stock versus monetary gifts? And what is the timing for this? Do the stock donations go first, or does the CRA have the first bite? And maybe we can talk about the implications of capital gains there as well, Jim.
The CRA always has the first bite and the last bite if they want it too. So the CRA always has to be paid first before anything else happens. And the thing with stocks is that if you leave stocks to a charity specifically, then suppose the stocks are worth, well, let's just do an example, because this may make it clearer to people. Suppose the stocks were worth $50,000 when you acquired them. When you died, they're worth $200,000. When you die, it's as if you sold them on the date you died, and you've got a gain of $150,000 that's taxable. However, if you leave the stocks to a charity, the charity will give you a taxable receipt for $200,000 because that's what they're worth, and you will have no capital gain to report to the CRA. So it's a double advantage to leave stocks, and it's certainly much more advantage than saying, well, the stocks were worth 200,000. I'll leave the charity 200,000. You'll get the receipt for 200,000, but you'll pay the tax on the capital gain.
Great, thank you. And the last piece of the question, which I think I can answer. So our viewer is asking, what proportion of a bequest is used up by the JBHF, so the foundation, for general admin? And that's really a range. I would say roughly between 15 and 20%, and that would be across all revenue or all donations received, not just specifically to bequests, but in any given year, that amount is roughly 15 to 17, 20%, depends on lots of different factors, but that would be about the average range. So that's great. Thank you for that question. Okay. Oh, I think we have another question. Oh, no, that one's done. Okay, we're excellent. We're good there. Jim, are you going to say something?
No, I was just going to say that when you talk about that percentage, there's a mandated range that you're supposed to be within.
That's
to
correct.
Keep on side with the CRA. And, that's just the cost of running the organization. And because it's very difficult to go out and raise funds to run the operations of the foundation, you've got to access other funds in order to be able to continue the kind of work that you do. And it's a good question to have, because people are very concerned because they see things in the news and online about, people making donations and the money all getting dissipated to run the organization, and very little of it getting to do the actual benefit. And I think that the JBHF does a terrific job in that regard.
Great, thanks, Jim. Yeah, and I would encourage, when you're thinking about making a charitable gift, or which charities you might like to leave gifts to, always a great idea to have a look at their financial statements and to make sure you understand the financial picture and the operations of the organization. And so if anyone's interested, certainly our financial statements are readily available on our website, as is other information about legacy and estate planning. And I'd encourage you to have a look at the website. It's jbhfoundation.ca. or to connect with my colleague, Emma Fitzpatrick, who I know our attendees would have RSVP'd. So you should have Emma's contact information if you'd have any more questions about the Joseph Brant Hospital Foundation. So I think, we're just about 2:46 now. I'll ask Frank and Jim, any other sort of parting or closing thoughts you'd like to share with our group this afternoon? We will
just reiterate, make sure you plan, take time, be thoughtful, and talk to the people who are going to have to deal with this after you're gone, both in terms of your care and what you want to see happen when you're gone.
Great, thanks, Jim.
Yeah, very well said, Jim. I think it's important to have frank discussions with your loved ones about their wishes and your wishes, just to help really guide the quality of care and the care that we give. And we're always happy to listen. Yeah, talk amongst yourselves. Very, very important to communicate your wishes. And yeah, Joseph Brant Hospital very much appreciates any support, just because we want to continue providing excellent service to the community of Burlington, and we're very proud of the hospital. So thanks a lot for attending.
Great. So thank you. Yes, Frank, I appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Jim, for your expertise and thoughts this afternoon. And I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for taking some time this afternoon to join us and to learn more about legacy planning and planning your legacy wishes. So thank you all. Hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everyone.